Hi, everyone. I hope you all can hear me. Welcome to Schaumburg Library's online program. It's nearly 7 o'clock. We will be starting shortly. I'm Sangeeta Bhargav, reference librarian at the library. And I have Jessica Zaucha, who's waiting to start the program. She is the co-owner and the lead therapist at the BZA Behavioral Group in Palatine, and she will be taking over. Just a quick note, if you have any questions for Jessica, you have the ability to ask. You can use the Q&A section or raise your hand. Those features are available at the bottom of your screen. And Jessica will take questions and will unmute you as required. Right now, every one of you is muted. Okay, so I am going to hand over the reins to Jessica and she will start. Thanks a lot, Jessica. Good to see you.
You too.
Looking forward to the program. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Sangeeta. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to use what has become such a familiar technology to reach out and connect to people. Glad to take any questions as we are going through the presentation. I did plan for about 45 minutes of content, and so I would ask that if there's a broad, more general question, that we save questions towards the end. But if you do have something that's related to the content that's being shared, go ahead and raise your hand or use the Q&A, and I will try to address those when there's an appropriate time to pause in the presentation itself. So as Sangeeta mentioned, my name is Jessica Zaucha. I'm the co-owner of BZA Behavioral Health. I'm a licensed clinical social worker for about 15 years, worked with predominantly teens and adults, but also can speak to child mental health as well. You won't have to look at my face the entire presentation. I have a PowerPoint for you. And I'm also happy to make myself available. The last slide will share some contact information. So please take note of that and don't hesitate to reach out to me if you'd like a copy of the presentation. If you'd like, if you have a question you're not comfortable asking publicly, you can go ahead and email me a question, and I'm happy to be a resource. So without further ado, give me a moment here to bring my presentation up. Oops. It would help to do a screen share first. There we go. All right. Sorry, bear with me, and this is the wrong presentation. Bear with me. Sorry guys. A little bit of all right. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to try that one more time. I brought up my wrong presentation, so I think I have a little bit too much open here. All right. All right, and I am hoping that everyone can see this here. Sangeeta, just so you know, when I have this full screen up, I am having a hard time seeing participants. So if you don't mind queuing me in if there is a question so that I don't miss anybody, that'd be great. But I'm gonna go ahead and get started here. I was trying to address that.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you. All right, so again, we're here to talk about, I hope, we're all here to talk about our mental health today. The idea is to give some tips and support for all of us during some challenging times, but also to speak pretty broadly about some mental health topics that I think are ever more present. So my hope is that by the end of the night, I've been able to help you guys and anyone watching later on to recognize the impacts of the current stressors that we're facing both nationally and globally on our mental health, to develop a better understanding of different emotion states and how they relate to mental health concerns, improve our ability to manage stress and difficult emotions. You know, I don't want to leave this presentation just with information, but hopefully some actual strategies, whether you're here on behalf of yourself or someone you care for. And then also to enhance our coping toolkit and our ability to support those we care for. And I like that word toolkit because there are, as a therapist, you know, I've had clients I've worked with for half a decade. And, you know, I think that, you know, as I've developed as a therapist, as they've developed as individuals, you know, we have, I like to think of it like a toolkit of different things that we can use to manage stressors and to manage our own mental health. And so hopefully tonight you walk away with a few extra tools in your toolkit. And that we can embrace opportunities for self-compassion, connection, and that should say resilience, I apologize, that ultimately bring us hope. So, strange times we are facing, as I'm sure all of you are abundantly aware and living through on a daily basis. Our current environment, and I'll kind of start with the global pandemic, has most certainly cause stress and reactions for people, whether they've had mental health concerns in the past or not. Just kind of a sampling of some of the headlines that we're faced with today. But, you know, even if we haven't directly been impacted through job loss or through illness or through the illness or death of a family member, or, you know, we are most all certainly, you know, impacted by social distancing and just the stressors of what we don't know right now, which causes a lot of anxiety. And of course, in addition to global pandemic, we're also facing a larger social movement that, you know, brings, I think, change and needed change for so many people and for our system as a whole. But also it brings more unknown and allows for a lot of that breeding ground for stress and anxiety to come to fruition. And also highlight some of the real challenges that folks who have experienced racial trauma or systemic racism and injustices are facing, in addition to a global pandemic that I think we can all relate to. And I think the unknown is really kind of where many of us are struggling right now. I know that's where myself and my family are. This was an image taken back in April, you know, but we had similar, this is in New York, but in Chicago, I know we had similar, we were bracing for the worst, I think still are. And so it's not just what we face today, but also what we anticipate and don't know about tomorrow that can really wreak havoc on our systems. And it's one of the reasons why, you know, if you haven't already, you probably will see headlines talking about mental health being the new front line as we face this pandemic. And of course, as much as there is hope and change, positive change that is coming as a result of some of the social movement that is currently going on, there's also imagery and stories that bring about feelings of fear. That can relate to our, you know, our kids and our families seeing these images, but it definitely brings about our own, it definitely challenges our own sense of safety and security. So, you know, my point here is not to belabor that these are challenging times or to stress us out more, but just more to validate that, you know, if you've noticed changes in your, you know, in your productivity and your sleep and kind of your mood overall, your tolerance, it's valid. We are going through what I think many would consider a global crisis and a national trauma. And I think, you know, it's just worth recognizing that if you or someone you love already had a pre-existing mental health concern, or if you didn't, that these times can definitely bring about those stressors, and that help is out there and it's an opportunity to build resilience. And I promise we'll get to that as we get closer to the end of the presentation. So first and foremost, let's kind of talk about mental health, because I do many of these presentations, you know, prior to what we've been facing over the last 3-4 months. And you know, prior to that, anxiety and mental health issues were not just anxiety wasn't just the #1 mental health concern facing our country, but really the #1 health concern. So more visits to hospitals, there's more disruption due to our due to anxiety and mental health concerns. And anxiety right now is the leading mental health issue that we see really across almost all populations. that, you know, in the past a couple of decades, we've seen a rise, almost you know, an epidemic of itself with regard to our mental health. 1 in 4 adults in the United States have been diagnosed with a mental health disorder in the past year, most commonly anxiety or depression. 1 in 17 have a more serious mental illness. But mental health disorders also affect children and adolescents. So back in 2010, 1 in 5 children in the United States had a mental health disorder, most commonly ADHD. But ADHD can also manifest or be a cover for some other underlying anxiety and mood issues or impulse control issues that we may not recognize in kids yet. And I'll get to some of that later as well. So it's really not unusual for adults or children to struggle with mental health issues, and not unusual to have even more than one. So shocking to me that really up until the last couple of years, we have, there's been, I think, a stigma still attached to seeking care for our mental health. So here we have the leading health issue in our nation, and yet people feel stigmatized to reach out for care for that. And I think there's a perception that, if you have diabetes, if you have a heart condition, if you have been diagnosed with cancer or hyperthyroid, that, that this is something going on in your body that you can't control. But that if you are depressed, anxious, or otherwise dealing with something that, is taxing your emotional system, that somehow is a failure on our part as human beings to manage something better. And I'm here to tell you, and I think most people who have sought treatment for mental health, is that these are no different than any other health issue, and we should be seeking treatment and supporting treatment as openly as we would support treatment for any of those other health conditions I mentioned. This is just a quick slide, just to kind of going back to some of the current crises that we're dealing with, just to kind of recognize that this is, when we look historically at crises, we see kind of a similar pattern. And so, not to go into depth on this slide, this was specific to kind of an increase in emotional and behavioral symptoms specifically in Washington State, where there was an early rise in cases of COVID-19, and kind of looking at how we respond. And so we can kind of see that, as we're kind of getting prepared for a disaster, in a lot of ways, there's real strong high emotion. Sometimes that's anxiety, a lot of times that's anxiety, but it can also be enthusiasm for making efforts. I know as a business owner, when we were completely taking our business and trying to remove it all remotely, there was so much action to be taken. There was homeschooling to do with my kid. There was so much to do that you did feel kind of an emotional high, even though it wasn't real positive one. But what we find after that is this long period of kind of ups and downs of the disillusionment. I think what people are talking about now is they're just feeling kind of done, feeling taxed, feeling weary of social distancing, of the actions that are to be taken. And so, the hopeful piece of this is that as we look at new construction, at reconstruction, we actually see that our mental health can actually improve after going through a disaster or a national crisis. And so that's the hopeful message, is that change does not happen in a system for an individual unless we are kind of pushed to a point of discomfort. So while no one would have wanted to see this level of discomfort being globally recognized and felt, I think we do have to know that this is also going to have bring on real opportunities for change. And so as a family, I know that's something I'm holding on to, is seeing changes happen already in my family that I plan to embrace. I hope that as a society, we see some of those changes, but this is an opportunity, and hopefully this presentation makes those of you who are watching seek where can you take this current crisis and create opportunity for yourselves and for your family to build resiliency, to be stronger, and to see sustainable change, and honestly, to be more prepared for future events that also tax us. Interesting to note on that front, people ask me a lot as a therapist, oh gosh, is mental health, people, your clients, must be struggling more than ever. And it's interesting. Certainly I have clients that are definitely impacted by this, but a lot of clients that I have that had pre-existing anxiety, almost describe it as though they've been kind of rehearsing for this, that they that the work they had done in preparation for just dealing with their own day-to-day anxiety actually kind of made them feel more prepared to deal with this kind of national crisis, which is really interesting and kind of a neat frame to look at, that in some ways, the resiliency built over years of especially getting treatment for a mental health issue actually it kind of insulated them from some of the real negative impacts that some of us are facing, as a result to the shock of our system of these unknowns. But we do know that there is overall not a positive effect on mental health that the pandemic has contributed to. According to a poll from May, sorry, my screen's in the way here. More than half of Americans, 56%, reported worry or stress related to the outbreak that has led to at least one negative mental health effect. So, trouble eating, sleeping, drinking alcohol more, headaches and stomach aches, short tempers, other health problems. And I'm also going to add in a lot of family dynamic issues, marriages and parent-child relationships can be strained. So we see that just elevated more among frontline healthcare workers and their families, where 64 to 65%, or 64% reported worsening mental health, and 65% of people who've lost income, which again is a high proportion of people. So again, just validating that this is definitely having an impact. That I think if you're here to see how you can address it, and so we're going to get into that. One note though is that it may take years to really understand the impact of this crisis on the mental health of our kids. And again, I'm going to put a positive spin here that I think in some ways we're going to see some positive impacts on kids. I don't know about you guys, but I see more kids out riding bikes and families taking walks. And I think we're learning to slow down a little bit. For the first time ever, I have kids saying, I'm sick of my screen, which is so delightful to hear. They want to be out and playing with friends. And so, but of course, how the imagery that they're seeing, the fears, it's going to have some kind of an impact. And I think part of our responsibility as a society is learning how to kind of roll with that and learning how to, identify it and validate their concerns, but also help them grow into more well-rounded human beings as a result of what they went through. Because truth is that when we don't have to look far back in our society to see other massive disruptions to society that people lived through, were resilient through, and came out stronger. So it may be the first for many of us. I know, for me, I've certainly never lived through anything like this, but we do know that there's potential for real growth. So I want to kind of just get us on the same page about when we're talking about some different mental health issues, really what they are, and also kind of normalizing some of some of these emotions, because, people ask all the time, like, well, what's the difference between anxiety? Like, how do I know when anxiety is something that is a real problem? How do I know when feeling depressed is actual major depressive disorder? And of course, a mental health professional, individually should be assessing that with each person. But kind of broadly to define that and just help us be all on the same page, I'm going to go through this. Just a note, I'm going to spend a little more time in this portion of the presentation talking about about anxiety, just because it's so prevalent, not only outside of our current environment, but in general, anxiety is such a common mental health issue. So the rest of them we're going to address, but the time period of this presentation doesn't allow for going into each one quite as in depth as I'm going to go into a little bit of treatment of anxiety. But anxiety, by definition, is just a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically at about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. We all will feel anxiety at some point, whether it's anxiety about a test that we have to do, anxiety about a presentation you're going to give for the Schaumburg Library, or anxiety about what's happening outside of your door, when riots are taking place, or anxiety about what's happening during the next school year when our kids are going back to school. So when we don't know or the outcome of an event, it's normal to feel a level of anxiety. Feeling anxious does not mean that you have diagnosable anxiety that is requiring treatment, but we can manage normal, typical anxiety with some of the techniques that I would teach somebody who does struggle with diagnosable anxiety. One of the things, though, that's so important in terms of changing the narrative around our own struggles with mental health issues is, first of all, learning that each one of these things we're feeling has an adaptive function. Anxiety in particular is related to our fear, our flight or fight response, flight, fight, or freeze actually response. So we don't have, you can look at our ancestors or even people who are going through, maybe a sudden experience, in today's world to see how this is adaptive. If you're walking down a dark alley and you start hearing footsteps behind you, your body is going to fill with physiological stress anxiety, which is going to feel like an adrenaline pump to your system, which is going to allow you to, your senses are going to increase, your muscles are going to tighten, you're going to be ready to act, to flee or to fight more effectively than if you didn't have that response. So we don't want to short circuit this response. We want to understand it and learn what our body's trying to tell us when we're feeling these things, and how to communicate back to it in a way that helps us to regulate anxiety when it's not going to help us run, fight, or otherwise adapt in a situation. So when we talk about diagnosable anxiety, that's really when our anxiety has hit either the amount of the anxiety we experience over a short period of time, the intensity of it, or the length of time we experience anxiety is causing a disruption in our functioning or our well-being. So again, if you are, someone who at some point over the last couple of months lost a couple of days to your life of, being glued to your TV and feeling like you were unproductive, that is, with this type of a situation, that's probably pretty typical anxiety response. If today you are still finding that your anxiety is impeding in your ability to parent, to go to your job, to go to school, to do the things that you would normally be able to do, to take care of yourself, to take care of your relationships, then it might be worth kind of looking to see if this is something that requires more treatment. Just a couple of anxiety diagnoses that we typically see include generalized anxiety, which is kind of like a more consistent feeling of worry or fear that is just pervasive and allows us to never really be at a restful state. Panic disorder, which are sudden onsets of panic and anxiety that themselves can feel like you're out of control of your body and your system. It can feel to a lot of people like they're having a heart attack. If those are happening daily or even weekly, that can obviously impact. People start to fear having a panic attack and will sometimes avoid situations that might feel like it would trap them. Other phobias, so specific fears of something that generally is something that you're gonna that is going to impact your ability to engage in life. So arachnophobia is a fear of spiders, and so someone might have a pretty strong reaction to spiders, but they may not seek treatment for it unless that fear of spiders is preventing them from being able to sleep or go into areas of their home because they're so fearful. And then obsessive compulsive disorder is another type of an anxiety disorder that is defined by having intrusive thoughts, worried thoughts, anxious thoughts that then we follow up on with someone who's diagnosed with OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder would have compulsive reactions that also interfere. So an example of that would be compulsive hand washing as a result of fear of contamination. I will just make note here that of all the clients I work with anxiety, both teens and adults, most people recognize that their anxieties are not helpful or rational. And that can be incredibly frustrating because they know better, essentially, but they can't stop their body's reaction. I'm going to get to why that is, but just to kind of note that this is a physiological response. This is not, you don't have to tell someone who has a fear of flying on a plane that planes are the safest way of travel, that they're more likely to get into a car accident on the way to O'Hare Airport than on their flight to California. Their fear is rooted in a different place, and so I just like to make note of that, because I think a lot of people feel very judgmental of their own anxiety. They feel like it makes them weak, or like people are judging that they're overreacting, and the truth is that their body is certainly reacting in a way that's not helpful, but they themselves tend to know and understand their anxiety differently. So I'm going to not go through every detail of this, but just to, as I mentioned before, anxiety is an adaptive response to that fight or flight sensation. So if you look at kind of the symptoms, if you will, that you're seeing here, the bodily symptoms, if you tied all of these to a fight or flight response, it's activating your body for action, or preparing your body for action, it would make a lot of sense, right? We're heating up, our heart's pumping, our muscles are tensing, including the largest muscle in our body, and which is our intestines. So that upset stomach that we may get, the bladder weakness, the butterflies, the headache, the sweating, all of these things are our body wanting to take action, but not having an outlet. If you were a prehistoric man and you were standing in front of a woolly mammoth, or if you were in that dark alley, these would be really helpful responses. But because it's happening out of nowhere or due to a stressor that we know we can't be running or fighting against, they tend to just sit uncomfortably in our system and be really problematic. And then they themselves kind of cause more distress. A note about ways that a child's anxiety may show up as something else. And I would broaden this and say that adults can have anxiety that looks different than what we would, than the typical panic attack or worried response we might anticipate too. But just to take a moment to kind of point these out for kids, we may see anxiety come out as anger or defiance because because kids can't express what they're feeling, and so that frustration comes out in a different emotion, a different elevated emotion than what we're expecting. The defiance is often their attempt to control a situation that they're out of control of. They may have a difficult time sleeping. Chandeliering, which I'm going to throw my poor an almost 9-year-old daughter under the bus on this one, or up through the chandelier, I should say. Chandeliering is when someone who seems calm kind of just suddenly flies off the handle for no reason. My daughter has always kind of trended towards a little bit of anxiety, but she manages it well. She's got a therapist mom, so she's yeah, you'd think that put her in good hands, but not so much. We can't therapy our own kids. But the other night we were out having a fire in the backyard because what else are we doing during COVID? And she had caught a little toad, and in letting this toad go after 5 minutes of being in a apparently very committed relationship with the toad, it took her about 30 minutes to recover from the toad leaving. And my human reaction to that was to roll my eyes and to tell her to get over it. It is a toad. But it didn't take long to recognize that this little toad and her emotional reaction is probably based on some other things, like missing her friends and the uncertainty of her future, that she's not able to really communicate. She usually presents as a pretty chill kid, and she's pretty happy being at home with mom and dad, but we see things like that a lot at home. So I like that chandeliering. So in this case, it's that it suddenly sends them straight through the chandelier. Lack of focus, which sometimes anxiety can be misdiagnosed as attention issues, because it can cause kids to have a hard time focusing when their bodies are filled with energy. Oops, and they're not able to communicate that. We can see it a little differently. Avoidance, refusal, so school refusal, which can look a lot like defiance, being negative about things, over planning. All these things can be manifestations of anxiety. I'm actually going to kind of quickly go through some of these slides. So I want to make sure we save a lot of time for discussion and for tools to use. But really, what causes anxiety and how is it treated? I guess in short, it can come from a lot of different sources. Our health habits, certainly stressors in the environment, like we're talking about, as well as genetics, can cause anxiety or really any mental health issues. But what happens is, in this triangle is considered the cognitive behavioral triangle, if you've ever heard of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, it's the most evidence-based treatment for anxiety and most mental health issues, even more effective usually than medication, but in combination with medication can be very effective. So you see this CBT reference there at the bottom. But we think about anxiety and other mental health issues in this triangle form, that we have these thoughts and feelings, physical sensations, and behaviors that kind of all impact one another. And so then we talk a lot about vicious cycles, that when your thoughts and your feelings are causing you to, your physical response to and your behavioral response to kind of, all kind of roll together, we get stuck in this negative cycle. So a lot of times CBT, and medication are looking to kind of bring some relief to that vicious cycle so we can shift it away. So again, I wish I had a little more time to spend on some of these, but just wanted to kind of give that basic framework. And I'm going to get to some of these coping skills in a few minutes later in the presentation, but just to kind of spend some time dealing with the regulating body through opposite action. I tell clients a lot when it comes to their toolkit, if you're going to divide your toolkit into 3 sections, you're going to have a section that's dedicated to things that can change the focus, which is that last one there. So anything that's going to get your mind off of what you're going through at this moment. You're going to have a section dedicated to things that can change the feeling, regulating your body through opposite action. And then you're going to have a section for changing your thinking. So that regulating of the body, I'd mentioned earlier that with anxiety in particular, it's a flooding of increased energy through the body. And so, as I mentioned, most people recognize that their thoughts and their feelings are not helpful to them in the moment. So that's not enough. So think about, there's a different part of our brain than our conscious rational brain that's in control when we are experiencing a strong emotion. And that part of the brain, the amygdala, is the most probably significant part of the brain. But that part of the brain is not a language-based organ. It gets information straight from the sensory environment, internal and external, and it shoots information up to the cortex, which is the thought part, the planning part. And then that part will then kind of reciprocate and give information to the rest of the system. So when information comes up through your body that says something is going on that's bad, and your sensory organ, your amygdala, says, yep, experiencing bad feelings, but your cortex can't figure out what to do about it or knows there's nothing to do about it, we get kind of stuck. So what we want to do is not necessarily try to manage anxiety through just thought patterns. I mean, it's certainly helpful to recognize when your thoughts are kind of getting ahead of you and negative, but and a lot of cognitive therapy deals with that. But sometimes first we have to go to the pathway that the amygdala first experiences information, and that's the sensory environment. So you have 5 senses, and if you can engage any one of those senses with information that reminds the amygdala that you're in a safe, calm place, you're probably going to have a better shot at managing that anxiety. So some ideas I give clients, I mean, deep breathing, mindful awareness of your environment, relaxation, and imagery are all really great tools that, again, if anyone's real interested in those, I can send some worksheets on, or you can find some information online about those things. But most importantly is just to recognize that trying to think through anxiety is probably not going to be effective until you get your physiological system to calm down a little bit. And the best way to do that is through engaging your senses. So some things I do to manage my stress is, these days with being out in the sun, I have like some really good after sun lotion that I like that smells kind of beachy. So giving myself kind of my arms and my legs some self massage and really smelling the lotion that I'm using is a good sensory exercise for me. Listening to music and only focusing on like one component of the song, the drum beat or the lead guitar or the bass or the piano, that I can just kind of focus the whole way through. There's a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 countdown, finding 5 things in my environment that I can see, 4 things that I can hear, 3 things that I can feel, 2 things that I can either taste or smell, and then 1 deep breath can be a good way to kind of just immerse yourself in your current environment and remind your anxious amygdala that it's responding to something that's not needed. But changing thought patterns, again, through thought stopping, recognizing and replacing distorted thoughts and finding positive coping statements is very beneficial. And we're going to get to some strategies for that in just a few minutes. This is, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is validation. As I mentioned earlier, people who struggle with anxiety or other mental health issues tend to know that their thinking patterns are not helpful. So there's some obvious things you don't want to say to someone that is struggling with depression or anxiety, but these are some of the less obvious ones, I feel like, that are often well-intended, but can actually come across more judgmentally and can reinforce a person's feeling that they're not in control and that they maybe should be. So saying that there's nothing to worry about, it's no big deal, just try to calm down, it's all in your head, you can just do it, just go out and do it, everything will be fine. I mean, how sympathetic is it, right? Oh, everything's going to be fine. It's such an easy thing to say. But, at the moment, that's actually not going to be as helpful as saying, can you tell me, just being there with a person, can you tell me more about what you're experiencing when someone says they're feeling really anxious? Would it help to talk about it? Sometimes it doesn't. Would it help to take some deep breaths together? Can I just sit with you silently? Maybe we can make a plan together how we can move forward. And also, it's not your fault. So just validating and letting that person know that they have options and making them feel unjudged can be a real effective way to help someone manage. Trauma is, I'm going to go through quickly a couple other mental health issues here, but trauma is actually another form of an anxiety disorder, but relating to a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. Its adaptive functioning is for self-protection, preservation, fight or flight. So in this case, we're thinking about when your body goes into shock as a result of trauma, it's for self-preservation of your system. And this is kind of what happens for emotional trauma too. So PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder might be diagnosed when someone is responding to a traumatic event or perceived trauma. And if they continue to experience those symptoms and disruptions in their life for a period of at least a month, after which the trauma has resolved. So again, if you're feeling, if you were in a car accident last week and this week you're still having a hard time getting back behind the wheel, we would kind of consider that a pretty typical trauma response. It's going to take some time and some gentle pushing to get back on the road. But if a month or 2 later you still can't drive, that might be something that we need to look at in terms of treatment. There's also an adjustment disorder, which might be diagnosed when someone is experiencing symptoms and disruptions, but maybe not quite to the point of PTSD. And right now, trauma is something, as I mentioned, that we're experiencing kind of on a global level. This picture here kind of demonstrates our healthcare system and kind of feeling like they're, drowning in a wave of COVID-19. And so our front line is definitely experiencing trauma, but just the news we see, if you've lost somebody, the uncertainty about job loss, these things can definitely create a trauma, both systemically as well as individually in people. And treatment can be helpful for those things. To address quickly, racial trauma or racially based trauma is a very real experience that demonstrates the effects of racism on an individual's mental and physical health. Can be linked to anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, as well as other physical health issues. And I think just the important note here is that a person who of a racial minority or someone who has as a racial group has people have experienced traumas, a person doesn't necessarily have to experience those things individually to experience some of that. I've had clients who talked about the fact that, like, I'm lucky. I grew up in an area where I didn't really experience much racism, and yet I still feel a lot of these feelings. And am I valid? And absolutely you are. And it's something that, I think we have to recognize that, when you have those shared experiences among a specific group of people, it can definitely contribute to racial trauma. And right now, because of the social movement with Black Lives Matter, a lot of those things are being stirred up, not just for one group of people, but for many groups who have been systemically have faced injustices and inequality. Different presentation if we want to kind of go into depth about that. We'll keep moving along here. So depression are feelings of severe despondency and dejection. Again, there's some adaptiveness here. I often bring people to, if you haven't seen it, you should watch Pixar's movie Inside Out. So we know that feelings of sadness and grief need to be felt sometimes in order to not kind of break the rest of the system down. In fact, sometimes when we don't experience grief in a way that allows it to come through, we're actually more prone to longer term mental health issues. So to be clear here, we can feel depressed about something, we can feel sad or grief, but not be diagnosed with clinical depression, which is kind of like anxiety is diagnosed when the amount or the intensity of the depression causes a disruption to our well-being or our functioning in one or more areas. So how I would talk to someone who's gone through a recent grief is going to be very different than how I'm coaching someone who is trying to kind of come out of a cycle of major depression. Someone who's experiencing grief, I'm doing a lot. I mean, with both, I'm going to do a fair amount of validation, but with grief, there isn't a magic word. You're not trying to have someone cope through that. You're really validating that this is a hard loss and sitting with them through it versus trying to kind of figure out how to quickly move through it. Where depression, we're looking at kind of how that cycle that I mentioned earlier, that triangle, where we can impact that negative cycle and start to see some better outcomes, whether that's kind of energizing the system a little bit, or by starting to walk, or changing sleep habits, or changing lifestyle habits, or looking at those negative thought patterns that tend to just kind of perpetuate the cycle, or engaging in pleasurable activities that there may not be an interest in, but that we know tend to produce positive outcomes with our emotions. And then lastly, just to give some quick attention to inattention and impulsivity. Here we're kind of dealing with ADHD and other like disorders, which can be experienced by both kids and adults. So inattention is difficulty sustaining concentration or attention, inability to stay on task. I didn't put it in here, but the adaptive kind of piece of that is that inattention, I think of, it's not, you're paying attention to too much. It's a problem with filtration, not that it's someone that doesn't want to pay attention, but has a hard time kind of prioritizing what to pay attention to. So we get easily distracted. And impulsivity, which is acting or responding on impulse without control, planning, or consideration of the consequence. Again, here, there's spontaneity is kind of a milder form of impulsivity that can be really good in terms of being willing to kind of go with the flow. But true impulsivity can create issues when we're not able to think about the potential consequences, and we make poor decisions as a result. And that can impact our behavior and then our relationships and kind of our functioning in different areas. So inattention and impulsivity can be a part of a variety of diagnoses, including mood and anxiety disorders or trauma. But separately, they would usually be diagnosed as a form of ADHD or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or an impulse control disorder. So now to the hopeful part. So there are treatment is available. Treatment is available for folks who are struggling, again, whether it's a diagnosable anxiety, depression, or impulse or inattention issue, or whether it's kind of a stress reaction that may not be, warrant a diagnosis, but certainly, we need to learn how to manage and protect ourselves anyway, even if it's not through a treatment provider. So this is just kind of a typical screen I've seen. This one happens to come from California, but these are some typical things that are out there that I know CADC, or not CADC, the CDC. CADC is Certified Alcohol and Drug Counselor. So sometimes I say that instead of the CDC, which is of course relating to the pandemic, or we're looking at, validating our concerns. It's normal to feel worry and stress during a time of crisis. Realizing what you can and can't control, which I'm going to get into, recognizing the signs of anxiety and learning how to manage it. So this is kind of broadly out there, and then this is what we're going to actually go into some more detail with in terms of managing for yourself, how to get through some of these tougher times. First and foremost is recognize numbing behaviors. Like most people, I found myself at the beginning of a lot of this glued to my telephone, my cell phone, reading articles on COVID and, and certainly around, around Black Lives Matters, just trying to stay tuned in. Well, at some point that awareness can become numbing behavior, and we find ourselves just trying to kind of get through. Well, getting through is okay if you're talking about a very short stressor that is going to resolve itself in a matter of hours or days. But to deal with something that potentially is going to impact us for the next year, numbing can create different sets of problems. So some typical numbing behaviors that I know to some extent I've probably experienced all of these, to an extent before I kind of caught and regulated myself. But eating, overeating, online shopping, increased alcohol or drug consumption, and that doesn't have to look like alcoholism. It can look like just, for me, just to be transparent, it was recognizing that for a period of 2 weeks, it was that feeling like I need that daily glass of wine at the end of the night, just to kind of calm down. Is that going to destroy my life and create an addiction? Probably not, unless I did it for years and years. But it's numbing a lot of different emotions too. And so we want to just be aware of those numbing behaviors. But getting stuck in front of the TV or your cell phone for hours, scrolling social media nonstop, and for kids and adults, excessive video gaming or online gambling. So how do we start to kind of brace ourselves against some of these impacts, whether it's due to COVID or just in general? How do we protect our mental health? So, first and foremost, create structure and familiarity in your or your child's day. Try to kind of keep a similar sleep schedule. As human beings we are supposed to kind of operate on a bit of a circadian rhythm. For an adult, that looks like a 8-hour sleep schedule followed by 16 hours of wake time. When we start going to sleep at all different times and then waking up at different times, we don't feel as well. Making sure that we're taking a shower and trying to make our bed daily, getting into those habits that just feel like they start the day. Eating meal at consistent times, with lack of structure, if we have people working from home, if our kids are at home, how do we kind of keep some of the daily structure that will help to just feel like we're, kind of staying in a pattern. And then one I want to share with you is this idea of BASE. So this is one I use a lot in my house. My daughter and I, almost every day, we build her BASE. And BASE stands for Body, Achieve, Connect, and Enjoy. So we without the structure of school or day camps and things that she'd usually be doing in the summer, and not wanting to put her on some sort of a timetable of that she has to be busy every 20 minutes, we come up with an activity or two, or sometimes 3 each day that gives her, that enriches her body, that gives her a sense of achievement or accomplishment, that makes her feel like she's connecting to someone, or sometimes herself, and that gives her a sense of enjoyment. And so what that does is, a lot of parents are asking me right now, how much is too much screen time when we're in a pandemic and mom and dad are working at home? And I'm not going to give a specific number on that. Recognize that there is a level to which we have that we're going to have more of that, probably with less structure. But if we're balancing it with making sure we're doing good things for our body, getting something done every day that makes us feel like we're achieving something, connecting with people in different ways, not just over social media, because that can be a go-to, but studies have shown time and time again that it does not have the same impact as a phone call, a physiological, like outdoor meetup. Those things are still really important when we can. And also just finding activities that really we're enjoying, and not assuming that just because I'm sitting and numbed or tolerating the time by looking at my phone, that I'm really truly enjoying that. In terms of some stress management strategies, the term radical acceptance is a big one in the mental health field. and I think really applicable here and now. Sometimes you'll run into a problem that's simply out of our control, and that those can make us feel like life isn't fair. I shouldn't have this problem, even though those ways of thinking only really make the pain worse. So radical acceptance refers to a healthier way of thinking during these situations. Instead of focusing on how you'd like something to be different, you recognize and accept that the problem or situation is what it is. Remember that accepting is not the same thing as liking it or condoning it. Learning to accept the problems that are out of your control will lead to less anxiety, anger, and sadness when dealing with them. So if we're constantly fighting against exterior stressors or even our internal stressor, if we're struggling with some diagnosable anxiety, constantly fighting against that is not going to help us. It's going to make us feel more judged and frustrated and kind of continue that cycle. So radical acceptance kind of frees us up to say, once I've recognized that I can't change the situation, I can look to what I can do, which is manage my reaction. So hand in hand with that is this is a tool that comes from DBT, which is a kind of an offshoot of cognitive behavioral therapy that likes a lot of these kind of acronyms and ways to remember coping strategies. So distress tolerance, we look at the at the word accept. So engaging in activities that require thought and concentration, and all these are kind of ways to tolerate something that again is out of our control that we've radically accepted. Finding ways to contribute, to volunteer, to feel like you're contributing to a purpose bigger than yourself. Doing some comparisons, but be aware of compare and despair, because it's easy to compare. Find yourself on social media and looking at the person who just went on a 3-week, they got an RV and went on a 3-week trip to manage their stressors right now, and to say, wow, I'm really unlucky. But instead to kind of compare your situation to something you've dealt with in the past and overcome, or something that could be worse. And this can also lead to gratitude. I know that this is a hard situation, but at least I have my health. At least I still have family. At least I can manage this. Emotions, do something that will create a competing emotion. So this is kind of changing that we addressed earlier, changing your emotion when you can. Pushing away, do away with negative thoughts by pushing them out of your mind. And again, this is not for things like grief or or worry that you might need to talk through, but when you've kind of gotten to the point where you know that you're not going to be able to overcome, do something to kind of get it out of your brain. Sometimes it can be writing something down and crumpling or throwing it away, or honestly just kind of distracting yourself and letting something else come into your mind. And so the example I use here is, if I tell everybody who's listening to do not think of a pink elephant, the image in your mind is a pink elephant. But if instead we all try to think of a blue rhinoceros, we're not thinking of the pink elephant anymore. Thoughts, when your emotions take over, try to focus on your thoughts, count to 10, recite a poem in your head, or read a book. And sensations, which we talked about earlier, let's get that amygdala engaged by giving sensations of safety versus kind of sitting with the negative emotion we're in. And as we kind of come to the end here, I'm ending on this slide because I think one of the most important things I can communicate I'm communicating every day to my clients, and I'll communicate to you guys, is that this is an important time to practice permission, validation, compassion, and gratitude for self and for others. Be aware of the hidden judgments and polarization in our relationships and with ourselves. This idea that, and we see polarization politically, we see polarization with our neighbors who may be social distancing more or less than us, and judgment, the idea that I can't be well, but also be worried. Whenever we judge our emotions, we're kind of polarizing within ourselves and with others. So, recognizing that everyone has, that every part of us and other people, they have a reasonable and rational reason for feeling like they do. And once we kind of get to that place and we are curious instead of judgmental about what causes us or the people around us to feel in a way that isn't consistent with kind of what we'd like to be feeling, all of a sudden we kind of release ourselves from the judgment, and we can be a little more compassionate and permissive to feel in a way that maybe we, would prefer not to feel, but that again is what it is. Try gratitude journaling or other exercises that challenge negative and judgmental thoughts. So this is a good one to practice as a family. To talk about something good that's happened today, what's something that what's something I feel good about, what's something good I can do for someone else. Those can be really good ways to kind of keep our balanced thinking when we're facing stressors. Validation, I'm going to spend a minute on this one because this is a hard one for me and my own family. Be aware of the but, and only one T here, but be aware of the but. What that means is that oftentimes when we are validating someone's feelings, we validate it and then we get our point across with a but. I know you're frustrated, honey, but this, and this, I know you're upset about this thing, but you need to understand that I'm feeling this way. So what you do when you say but, whether it's to your kid, your spouse, or to yourself, hey, I know you're anxious, but you can't keep doing this. Whenever we do that, we actually aren't validating ourselves at all. We're acknowledging, but then we're saying, but you don't, but the second part is a priority. So I challenge everybody that first of all, to use validation, like try to understand what's going on, either internal to ourselves or with other people. But finishing that with an and instead of a but. Honey, I know you're really frustrated, and I need you to speak more calmly to me when we're trying to address these things so that we can come to a better solution. To my daughter, kiddo, I know that you are really, really upset about that little toad jumping away. And I'd really like to find a way to kind of move past it so we can continue to enjoy our night. When we get rid of the but and replace it with an and, we find that we can do a much better job of allowing both things to exist and to reduce that polarization. And then last but not least is just practicing kindness and compassion as often as possible. And I'd love to, as a social worker, I'd love to say that this is all altruistic, that we're doing this for other people. But the truth is that we feel good when we are kind and compassionate to others, when we offer and extend that compassion. So look for opportunities, when you're not wearing your mask, to smile, to compliment someone, to do something nice for someone else, to check in on a friend. Like, those things are not only going to kind of bridge the gap and make us feel more connected, but they really do a good number on making us feel good as well. So this is the formal end to my presentation. I am going to get back on screen so that I can kind of see questions as they come up, but this is the information to reach out to me. BZA Behavioral Health is our practice, and we do have some great resources on our website, as well as services if that's something that anyone is interested in. Our front office staff is also trained to offer resources if there's something that we don't have at BZA. And my email, as I said, I have no problem with anyone shooting me an email or calling me at my office if you have a question, or if you'd like any resources. My goal is to extend these things to as many people as possible. And so that honestly, so that we have less people coming into our office, because unfortunately, with where mental health is today, there is a need out there, and my goal would be to teach people how to manage it as well as they can, so that they don't get to that point of needing treatment. But if you do, we're here. All right. Did I miss any hands during this time, or did we do okay, Sanjita?
Yeah, no, you're doing good. That was very interesting.
Thank you.
A lot of good information. I have a question, and I'm sure others would have, and they start chatting in. But I have a question. It's regarding people who have lost their jobs.
Yes.
And they are struggling with their mortgage, their bills, no health benefits available, very anxious, and letting them know to get into different activities or volunteer stuff when they are going through so much anxiety. Would you be able to give some more thoughts on how do they handle all that they are going through?
Well, I think one of the things that I've seen as a positive, we were noting it within our organization, but also kind of across the board, is how many people are compelled to offer help and support right now. So I think that there can be sometimes isolation and shame that can come along with needing help. But there are many organizations that are offering free support. So I know we're offering free parenting groups and some free support groups and some pro bono. So don't be afraid to search. But also know that I think one of the hardest parts about when we're feeling helpless in a situation where we've lost our job and our benefits is that at the time where we sometimes need the most motivation and inspiration, it's lacking, because that's part of that vicious cycle that goes around, is that then we're drained, we're anxious, we're stuck, and so we don't know where to turn. And that can be where finding a partnership with someone, whether it's a professional or someone in your life who is validating but also kind of positive, can be helpful to kind of figure out a strategy. It is normal to feel kind of paralyzed by stress and fear when we are going through hard times, and knowing many people in my own life who have dealt with some of those very real stressors that, again, no, you're talking about grief and real anxiety that is nothing you did to put yourself in that position. But by protecting our mental health, we keep ourselves most able to be resilient when that job does come along, or to figure out strategies to get by. And again, there's resources out there, if you're willing to partner with someone and look. So I know that's, there's no easy solutions to these issues, because they're very real and they're hitting us across the nation right now, across the world. So I guess the most important message I have is that you're not alone, and help is there. Just be willing to ask. But that's a great question. Do we have anyone else who had any questions, or, again, if you'd like to share anything on a personal level that you're and not necessarily, if you want, if this won't be a group therapy session, that's a different support. But if you're looking for a specific resource, it might be helpful to someone else. If you have a question about mental health, likewise, that could be helpful to someone else.
If somebody just asked if you have any resources you could share, that would be amazing.
Any resources? Well, locally, there are some community mental health centers. So I would shout out to some of the main ones in our area, which is Kenneth Young Center and The Bridge in Palatine, as well as Amita Alexian Brothers Mental Health. There's a wide offering of different ranges of treatment if you are looking for mental health care. Again, at BZA, we are offering, we have teen groups, young adult groups, as well as preteen groups, and a free parenting group that's currently running to support parents. We'll do a free consultation if you just want to kind of check out services. So I think that those are some good places to start. We have a lot of resources on our website. I don't know if there's a specific type of resource, because that's kind of a general question. So if there's a specific resource, I can certainly dig into my, or if you're more comfortable, you can email me and I'm happy to provide specific resources if there's a type of group or support that you're looking for.
We'll just wait for a few more seconds if anybody else has any questions.
I will say, as again, if anything kind of comes up here, I have a little chat button there. Okay, perfect. If a lot of mental health practitioners are offering a combination of video as well as telephonic or in-person sessions. Previously, those were not covered broadly by insurance, and now they are. So, I know one of the things that our practice offers is that, briefer sessions and low sliding scales is something that, can be accessible if you're looking to talk to somebody, but recognize too that you don't have to, if you're anxious or not comfortable going into an office. We have about 85% of our practice right now is still over telehealth. So it's been pretty effective, and it's something that I think I have a handful of clients that, even when we're out of the pandemic, will probably enjoy just the therapy from the comfort of their home. So so it's a real great resource if you're looking for a way to connect, but you're not physically able to go into an office.
Okay, then we are done. I'm going to stop the live stream. This recording is available on YouTube for those who want to review or forward it to their friends, family to take a look at, and at some point it will be taken down. But thank you so much, Jessica, for your time, for all the information. That was really great.
Yeah, thank you for having me. We enjoy the opportunity, like I said, to reach out to the community and just kind of, this is a time to come together. And I didn't mention it, but the idea of resiliency is really something that I want to leave people with, because this is, as a society, as individuals, we don't get stronger until we kind of are broken down. And I know that that's a hard pill to swallow per se, but substance abuse has talked about it for years. If you've ever heard the term hit rock bottom, we use that term a lot. And what it really means is that we get to the point where the cost of staying the same is greater than the cost of change, because change is tough. So I think as much as we're trying to kind of get through, and, Sanjita, you mentioned job loss, I know that a couple of years ago when my husband lost his job, and the anxiety and the stress that came along with that. And I think sometimes the other side of that brings resiliency and opportunities. So keep an eye out for those, and be aware of your narrative, that when we are looking to how can we kind of get through this, it's not just get through, it's how do we become stronger. And I'm really hopeful as a society and as a nation that this is going to bring us together, and become more aware than ever of our individual and collective struggles. So I have a pretty hopeful feeling that at the end of this, we'll look back at a time that made us stronger and didn't break us down completely.
I'm liking the positive note you're ending it with. Okay, thank you everybody for joining, and we are going to stop this. If you have any questions, follow-ups, feel free to either email Jessica, you can email the ref desk at stdl.org, or email me directly. Okay, have a good night, everyone. We'll see you all.
Thank you.